Here's a list of attributes or elements that are synchronized for each SDP. Meter data, count data, CTPT multipliers, framing structure, V, service codes. Are a few of them. You can get into
CTP multiplier. You can also have the meter register multiplier built into that.
Okay, so what is called the CTPT multiplier with ISO within the specifications is actually the product of the CT, the PT, and the meter multiplier. Okay. So for the most part, that becomes your CTPT. Well, it is, yeah. But with all these new smart meters being multiplier 1, effectively it's the CTPT. But if you do get into meter multipliers down the road, the transformer rated meters or whatever, you have to remember that what you're sending in your sync file is the product of those three things. Okay. CTPT is kind of important
Combination of the register.
because as meter data is processed by the MDMR, it's multiplied before it's stored. So if you have to retroactively synchronize a changed CTPT, that means you have to resubmit all that meter data because it's multiplied as it's processed. So CTPT is one of the ones that can cause you a bit of a headache if you have to make changes. Okay, I've mentioned a couple times today that sync files are actually a set of files. Here's a listing of the files. File 0 is what's called a manifest file. It tells the MDMR what to expect with this file set. So each of the files have sequence numbers. So the manifest file will tell MDMR this is file set number 42. And it's coming along with 2 file number 1s, 1 file number 2, 3 file number 3s, and so on. And the reason you might send more than one file is if the files become very large. For a psync file with 40,000 SGPs, your asset data file is going to contain 40,000 records there of listing the meters. And if your AS2 client has file size limitations, it may become necessary for you to split up the files. I haven't seen that too often. For the most part, utilities aren't having to split up their files. But that's what the manifest file does. It describes to MDMR what files are coming along with this file set. Okay, file number 1 is asset data files. Describes the meters, for example. Meters are assets. COM modules are assets. File number 2 is the premise data file. So this is the file that you would submit the address in, some other premise-related information. File number 3, service agreement data file. This is your framing structure, commodity type. File number 4, parameter data files. So this would be something like the number of dials for a meter. So it's the additional attributes of an SDP or a meter. File number 5 is your relationship data file. So this is the file that you say a particular meter is related to an SDP. So it combines the different attributes. File number 6 is not used anymore. And file number 7 is that virtual meter information. I don't think it's quite there yet. But this is, if you thought that this was going to be an option for you to communicate any of your STPs where there's more than one meter assigned, you'd want to still pay attention to the specs here and get that programmed and ready to go for when MDMR's finished.
Quick question on that then. So, assuming it's not ready then, you just synchronize them to 2 separate USDPs for the.
If that was an option for you. Then yes, you could do it that way, or you could perhaps synchronize only the primary meter. I don't know if that makes any sense. Like usually these installations are a meter for the heat or something, right?
Yeah, were you guys splitting into 2 accounts though when you couldn't convert?
They're going to have the option to do
You have
that.
the option of upgrading their service to a single meter or paying 2 bills.
And having 2.
There you go.
Which
So you've
separates
done it
two
with 2
accounts.
pod IDs, and you'll create 2 pod IDs. And
Two
If
separate
they elect
accounts.
not to upgrade their service, then
Yeah,
they're
that's
going
the
to
most
pay
in
2 invoices.
West Ontario too.
Yeah.
Is that all going to be
Separate.
done by the end of November? They'll be either one or the other way?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So maybe
So you won't
have to-
you won't need
you don't have to worry about 7? Okay.
No.
Good.
I think this will come into play a little bit more down the road when you start getting any apartment buildings or whatever with suite metering in. You can start to do virtual.
But even
meeting.
that, I think each suite is gonna have
For
its
the
own.
most part, but it might have common areas that need to, like elevators and common area lighting and things like that that are aggregated together.
Are each of the files optional, other than obviously the
No,
manifest file?
file 6 and 7 don't have to be sent. If the manifest file lists file 7, you have to send it, but it's empty. But if the manifest file doesn't list it, you don't have to send 7. The rest of them are mandatory, 1 to 5, 0 to 5 are mandatory. Okay. Okay, so I talked a little bit about this a few seconds ago, that you can split or segment these files into smaller pieces if you need to. And if you do that, you have to segment them properly, but for the most part, I don't think you guys will have to do this. And then the manifest file must list that. This is a diagram that talks a little bit about sync file processing at MDMR. And I put it sort of into a business process type of a diagram, but so the CIS is going to generate these sync files and then move the files through the AS2 client down to the MDMR. And then this is the more important stuff down here. When the MDMR receives those files, the first thing they do is load these files into staging tables. So if you have any exceptions during the staging table loader process, you will get a report. It's called the IR14, and it talks about exceptions in that staging table loader. If the MDMR successfully loads your sync data into the staging table, then they will begin processing it. This is separate and discrete, away from this piece into this piece. So if you've got successful staging table loader tables, reports showing that it is successfully loaded, then you know that your, for example, your sync sequence number has been advanced. If you sent them file number 42 and you had a successful staging table loader report, you know that 42 has been processed and they will next time be expecting number 43. And then you'll start to look for the updates and exceptions report that tell you about the activity in that file. They will start to process updates. They move this data into the to be published tables and then report on it from there as they're loading it into the meter master data. So you get what's called the IRO6 and the IRO7 reports, updates and exceptions. Those reports are generated during this process of publishing data. So there's separate reports that tell you the stages of sync file loading. Okay, you send the files from the LDC to the MDMR, load it into staging tables, move into to be published tables, and then when they're completed, you get updates and exceptions reports for the process. Okay, there's a report that comes out even before the staging table loader that talks about two processes in particular. If you submit files out of sequence, you will get what's called an IR10 report. And then because the files are as many as 7 files being submitted, and some of them can get large depending on the number of updates, it may take some time for MDMR to actually receive all the files. So if it takes them longer than an hour to receive the full file set, they will reject the file set, and that comes out on the IR10 as well. So there's what's called the maximum wait time of an hour, and the file sequence that they check. And if any of those things are missed, they will give you an IR10 report describing how they've rejected the file. So the IR10 is an event-driven report that comes out only if those two problems have been encountered. So this is kind of one of those reports where it becomes business process intensive to think about this, because you don't get these all the time. In fact, you never want to ever get one. So if you're looking for particular reports, users can kind of get used to never seeing them, and then when one comes in, they kind of don't notice it. But the IR10 is a critical one to see, so we need to figure out that business process. That's one that maybe you talked about a workflow item or something where maybe the system could detect and then send out an email, bells and whistles going off. There's an IR10 detector. and you can
Like
fix
that
it.
one seems more like an IT-ish
Yes.
problem already, that's something
Yes.
that would come to our group and we would say, yeah, something went wrong on the file building or the transmission or
Yeah.
something.
Yeah, I agree. Here's another slide just talking about that staging table loader process. So the IR14 comes out, telling you about staging table loader. So you'll, for the most part, when you start to see this report, it's not that hard. You're just opening it up and looking for your error code 00. If you get other than error code 00 on the report, for the most part, you have to go and look at the report's technical specifications and figure out what the error codes mean. They go up to like 99. So it's not something you can really put into a business process if you get this, do this. It's a little bit more complicated than that. So for the most part, you're just looking for error code 00. If you don't get that, you're looking at the specs. Okay, so SDP is affected by rejected records are not loaded in the staging tables, no updates are made. Okay, so I'm going to talk from a high level about some threshold checks that happen during sync processing. This is one of the things that probably have changed a little bit in the newer versions. At the time that we generated these slides, back in version 2, this was the best understanding that ISO had of the e-meter sync processing as far as threshold checks. So I think it's okay to understand this from a high level, but if you really want the details, you need to kind of go to the technical specs around how these things work. For the most part, what you need to understand is that if it looks to the NDMR like too much has changed across your service territory, they stop, right? Because, like for example, in a P-Sync, if you don't submit an SDP in your P-Sync, they inactivate it. So if you ended up creating a broken P-Sync file that only had half of your USDPs, you wouldn't want the NDMR to inactivate half of your service territory. So there are checks in place that prevent things like that from happening. So the first check is to look for empty sync files. If it's a sync file, if it's an empty sync file, they don't process it. And that's, I don't know why they put that there as a check. Check number 2, though, the next 3 checks are kind of similar in nature. They look for the first one is number of records. So if you have a sync file that successfully processes, and then the next sync file comes in with like half as many records, and we're thinking about P-Syncs here, right? Half as many records, they will reject that, so there's too much change here. The next 2 are updates and exceptions. So if they start processing a sync file and there's just way too many updates, they would say there must have been something wrong here. For example, a good example of this would be you send in a sync file where all of your meter numbers have leading zeros. And then you do maybe a CIS upgrade or something, and all of a sudden the next sync file goes out and every meter number has no leading zeros. Did I say that right, or did I say that?
Yeah,
One had leading zeros, one didn't. But even though the actual numbers, the significant digits there are the same, this looks to MDMR like you've changed every meter. And so you wouldn't want them to process that sync file, right? So that's the sort of thing that would be, that's an example of updates that you wouldn't want to actually have updated that MDMR. And then the last one is exception. So they start processing it, but it looks like everything is an exception, they'll stop processing. So from a high level, it's a good thing to understand that there are checks and balances at MDMR that would stop bad things from happening in your sync processing.
And is there like a kill switch thing? Do you realize it after you sync something?
Not if they've started processing it.
No, but you might have that hour, right, in the staging.
If it goes out in your AS2, I think you're in trouble.
You need to call them and maybe.
Yeah, I'm not sure they'd be able to stop it unless they had their parking lot enabled. I don't think they'd be able to stop it. Okay, once they pre-validate the sync files, there's a few simple business rules they go through. We don't get into too much of the detailed business rules here because there's so many business rules. Synchronization processing is pretty complicated. But basically, if an SDP exists in the meter master data and in the sync file, the MDMR will compare the data they have against what's in the file and update the relationships accordingly. If an SDP exists in the meter master data and the sync file contained errors, then no updates are made. If an SDP exists in the file but not in the meter master data, then they create the SDP. This goes back to the first session there, where they create the SDP through synchronization, and they populate the the mandatory attributes that are communicated in the sync file there. And if an SDP exists in the meter master data, but not in the sync file, this is again that scenario where they inactivate the SDP. So if it's in the meter master data, they're expecting to hear about it, but you don't send them any information about it, they inactivate that SDP. Again, at the end of all that, you get back a couple of reports, IRO 6, IRO 7. So generally what you want to see is stuff on your IRO 6 and nothing on your IRO 7. So basic processing logic there. You want to see updates and no exceptions. Every iSync you send. The psync, because it's a current set of attributes, you should see nothing on your updates or your exceptions. Okay, here again is the list of reports. So the IR10 comes in advance of any of the processing there, only if you have problems with maximum wait time or files out of sync. IR14 tells you about the staging table loader, and then IR6 and 7 are the updates and exceptions. If you look in the TIS, there's 14 scenarios that can result in synchronization data being generated. These are some of them, maybe all of them, split out according to typical departments in the utility, like metering. You could communicate meter changes, removals, new services, record modifications in metering, VEE, service code changes, or manual exceptions that you're trying to resolve at NDMR. AMCC type, once set, I don't think you ever change that for the most part. Census meters are collected by the census system. Billing, collection, service address modification, final billing of accounts. So you're ending an account relationship there. Actually, we've got a new service down in this swim lane. Bill code changes, that isn't actually in the TIS as something that goes in the sync files because bill codes don't. But if you've set your VE service code to be dependent on a bill rate code, then changing a bill rate code might in fact impact your sync data. Deleting accounts, route number changes, service status, so there's your disconnect, reconnect flags, VE service codes, framing structure. So all this stuff that you're changing at a utility affect records that go into a sync file and eventually get into an iSync file. It changes. This little decision box here, iSync before psync. For the most part, because you don't want to communicate any changes through a psync, when it comes time to process a psync, you always create an iSync immediately before that. Make sure your changes have been processed, and then you would move forward with your psync process. Okay, so that's kind of a view of business processes to think about. If you're trying to map out your processes, a good place to start is sort of thinking about those things that are commonplace at the utility. Okay, actually it's probably a good spot to break for lunch if you want.
Yeah.
Before we get into psync, so a little bit more specific psync than iSync in the app. So some early adopters used to just send psyncs every day instead of an iSync. But that's not the way it works anymore. You can't send psyncs that often, and iSyncs is much easier on your systems anyway, just sending the changes. So that last point there is probably the most important. It's not intended to support daily updates. Okay, you can do a couple different things with psync, though. You can, like we referenced in the SDP request response presentation, this is one way that you could create SDP objects in the MDMR. So you can tell MDMR about an SDP for the first time through psync if you want. Again, this kind of applied to earlier versions of eMeter software. Conceivably, you could update attributes for SDPs, but that's not the way we want to think about psync. And again, this last one here is sort of the same as the first one, initializing the MDMR with those mandatory attributes and relationships with the MDMR, so kind of a one-time enrollment process to set up the MDMR for your future sync processes. So there's 3 things there listed, but really you can only create and then audit your SDPs with psync. The assumption with psync is that it's going to contain a record for every LBC SDP ID. So once you've created an SDP or a USDP object of the MDMR, you must include it in your psync, otherwise they will inactivate it if you don't include it. So current relationships are all that are sent in a psync file. You just send in the active meter, the date that it started, and there's no end dates in psync files. It's all the current relationship. This is sort of what used to happen if you tried to process changes through a psync file. For example, if you processed a meter change in your CIS last Wednesday, then the end date of the old meter would have been last Wednesday, and the start date of that new meter would have been last Wednesday. If you didn't send that in an iSync file, but sent a psync file today, the psync file would say, this is the new meter, this is the meter, and it started last Wednesday. And that's all that you would send. And so they would say, well, this isn't the meter that we have here. We have this other meter associated with this premise. So they would see a change there. And what this statement here, inferring the end date, is telling is that if they had seen a relationship that was different than what they have, they would infer an end date. And the date that they use is the file creation time of the psync. So if they sent a psync in at 2:11 today, and they saw that there was an old relationship there, they would end that old relationship as of 2:11 today and start up the new relationship. So this is not what you would want to happen anyways, right? Because in that case, in that example, the meter change happened last Wednesday. So you wouldn't want the end date of that old meter to be today. Otherwise, you're going to have pieces of meter data that will never get properly processed.
I guess, how would you process, if, let's say a meter change was skipped like last Wednesday?
Yeah.
Would you just set a regular sync? But how would you date it to last Wednesday when the new meter came in?
So so this is the
Like didn't happen last night, it would happen past tense.
yeah. So if you so this is how most of your meter changes happen, right? Like it happens, and then it takes a couple days for paper or whatever to come in, and so you key it in, and you say that meter was removed as of X time ago, last week or whatever, and the new meter started then. And so once you establish that new meter to SDP relationship, now because it happened in the past tense, all the meter data associated with that new meter has been lost, and so you need to resubmit it. And this is the hard part of it.
So
the
you
meter
can
change, right?
resubmit?
Yes, you can submit sync relationships in the past, right? You can say this happened a week ago. You can say it happened 6 months ago. But things that are meter data related that happened sometime in the past usually require that you resubmit meter data, because any of that meter data that's been submitted since that time has been incorrectly processed, right?
So here's my question, how would you re-get the data? Just-
From ODS for the most part. In Ontario, you would use the ODS. If you were in an environment where you didn't have this second system kind of holding on to meter data, you would have to ask your AMI provider for it. And usually this would probably not be their standard process, so it might come with some cost. Because in their view, they would be saying, I've already given you
So
the
the
meter
easiest
data.
way
Why?
to actually do it right away the next day.
Well, so I guess strictly speaking, the answer is yes. I mean, yeah.
So automation.
But because we've got these ODS systems set up and configured in Ontario to just sort of look at sync files and say, hey, that sync is that meter change happened a week ago, they just grab all the meter data they've got sitting there from a week ago and just resubmit it all. It's automated. So while the answer to the question you asked is yes, it would be best to synchronize on a daily basis for changes that happen today. I mean, real life is you're not going to be able to do that all the time. But you
No.
don't need to stress about it because we got the ODS here to pick that stuff up and resubmit it.
For the one-offs that are bad, but
Yeah.
if you if your business process took care of it right away,
That would be ideal, yeah.
that's the ideal way, okay. Just trying to get that through our heads, because, you know, there are times you're not gonna get the data for some reason.
For whatever, yeah.
Well, and getting back to the Ulster system, right? Like you, probably what you will end up doing is developing some sort of sync process that is triggered by your sync to the MDMR. So the MDMR takes a pipe delimited sync file. Ulster takes an XML file. So you're gonna have to do something in between the two. But before you sync with Ulster, you're probably gonna end up creating a file for the MDMR, right? And then you'll feed that into something that generates an XML. And so based on the way that Ulster collects data and this requirement to update mass with any changes, or EAMS, then you do need to make this happen as quickly as possible. Otherwise you're losing register reads, like we talked about earlier, right? The register reads are only collected during actual communication with the meter. So until you put that meter into a schedule, you're losing register read information. So there are many reasons why you want to synchronize as quickly as possible. Okay, from a high level, we'll talk about P-Sync business process. So let's go through the steps here. Sync operator swim lane, up at the top here. Going to initiate the P-Sync process after hours. We specify after hours for this box because P-Sync is going to include all records, all STPs. It's going to include information about all your STPs. So you probably don't want to do this during business hours. It's going to be a big file. You wouldn't want the CIS trying to populate a file with information while somebody might be trying to change information in your CIS. That's one reason you'd want to do it after hours. Another reason is that you're going to try to generate an iSync file before you run a P-Sync file. Earlier we talked about this need in the synchronization process to get your reports back from MDMR, process, read the reports, review the reports, make sure it was successful. So in order for you to do this and then create a P-Sync without any changes happening between the time you read your iSync reports and generate a P-Sync file, you probably want to be doing that sort of in an after-hours format where no one's making changes. Again, different reason, but same concept. You don't want changes happening. So that, I think, for the most part, for P-Sync is an after-hours process. It's a process that you're going to do when there's no updates being made, I guess is a better way of saying it. Because you could make this sort of after hours, in a sense, by sending out an email saying, read-only access now to CIS or something, right? Make it so that there's no more updates. If you start that at 2 o'clock in the afternoon or something, generate an iSync and then get your reports back and run a P-Sync, you sort of accommodated that need to not make any updates, right?
Are there like blackout times in MDMR like regularly, like a weekends out of the question?
So, for quite a while now, there have been updates on weekends, blackouts, where they enable the parking lot. And it's sort of system maintenance type of thing. Lately, it's been version 7 related stuff, updates. But yeah, they do system maintenance typically on Sunday nights, I think.
Okay. So I mean, like, you could necessarily make a schedule to do that on Saturday, Sundays because it might not be available, right? So you should
Right.
plan for after hours.
Yeah, so if you're large enough where they become concerned about your P-Sync, you would schedule this. They would tell you when the file should land.
Right.
Sync file processing happens a bit quicker, apparently. We're being told with version 7 now, the new version. Sync file processing is supposed to be happening a bit quicker than 6.3. But to give you an idea, one of the last P-Syncs that I was involved with down at PowerStream, they were at about 80,000 STPs. Took MDMR about 10 hours to process the P-Sync.
Wow.
So it's a fairly intensive process, right? It takes a little bit of horsepower to run through the file, make sure everything's okay. And this is why they want to babysit the file, so they kind of get you moved on peak times. That's what the next box is all about there, contact IESO. So you're going to try and schedule this with them. The other reasons you might need to talk to them, we talked about thresholds earlier. So if you send a P-Sync and it's got 500 customers in it, and then you enroll the rest of your population, and now it's 14,000 or whatever, I mean, that's an awfully big change, right? So that this would stop the file from processing if you didn't disable those thresholds. So this is something else you can have ISO do, is disable your thresholds. So that's another reason you might want to talk to them. And then part of your business process should be to do an iSync. So this, eventually when we get to customizing this process for you, that won't be a decision box anymore. It'll just say go to your iSync process, because we will have talked about it enough times that I hope by then you will agree that an iSync is required before you do a vSync. And so we'll just have that as part of the process. Once the CIS starts building a vSync file, this is called file 3000. This is a snapshot in time of all your current attributes and relationships. At some point in the process, it doesn't have to be right here. It could be as part of your AS2, but you should archive your sync files in some way. At some point, you may need to find out what went out in sync file 13, and you may need to grab some of those records and